Well, one of the things that Sharon and I did on our trip to Turkey, and this is not the presentation for the trip to Turkey that I said that I'm working on. This is just a little bonus this morning. But one of the things Sharon and I did on our trip to Turkey was take a tour of a carpet weaving factory. Turkey's handmade carpets have been world famous for centuries, both for their beauty and their durability. The oldest known Turkish carpet that exists today is about 2,400 years old, dating back to around 400 BC. And in that detail, you can notice the intricate design of this carpet made so long ago. The artistry and the craftsmanship is really pretty impressive. There are thousands of different designs. Traditionally, every tribe, clan, village had their own designs which uniquely identified them. Here are a few photos to give you an idea of some of the designs and color variations, and it's really hard to try to capture the beauty and the variety of these carpets in photos, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea. Go ahead and roll through those, Gabi. Go ahead. Like I said, this is just a real quick sampling of some of these. And you guys have seen these carpets and different things. Now, these carpets are still being woven by hand in the finest traditional factories, like the one we visited, and these were some of the women that were working there weaving these carpets the day that we were there. During this weaving process, it's not easy for an observer to discern what the final design will look like. During this weaving process, looking at the underside of the carpet and the untrimmed threads, only a skilled weaver is able to see what that carpet is going to look like when it's completed. And our life can be that way, can't it? It can look like a jumbled up mess, multicolored, untrimmed, random, but the master weaver of our life knows what he's doing and the beauty that he's creating. Last time, we began a study through the book of Ruth. And we met a woman named Naomi who, with her husband and 2 sons, they left their hometown of, you can take that down now, their hometown of Bethlehem in Israel, and they moved to the foreign land of Moab to escape a terrible famine. While in Moab, Naomi's husband and 2 sons all die, leaving her alone in this foreign land except for her 2 daughters-in-law. She was able to convince one of her daughters-in-law, Orpah, to return to her own parents' home and begin rebuilding her life. But Naomi's other daughter-in-law, Ruth, refused to leave her. In fact, Ruth made an incredible statement of loyalty to Naomi that even today is looked at as one of the most beautiful vows of friendship and loyalty ever made. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 16, Ruth said to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Well, receiving word that the famine had ended back in the Bethlehem region and having no reason to stay in Moab, Naomi returned to Bethlehem with her daughter-in-law Ruth in tow. Naomi's name means pleasant, delightful, lovely, and that had always been an apt description of her countenance. But when she arrives in Bethlehem, she tells everyone, "Don't call me Naomi," meaning pleasant, lovely, delightful. Instead, call me Mara, which means bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. She said, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Naomi has lived through unimaginable tragedy, losing her husband and her sons. She's lost everything that she held dear to herself. To make matters worse, we talked about this, that in that time and culture, an older woman who was a widow with no living male children was as destitute as a person could be. She had a life of severe poverty as a beggar to look forward to. Although she was failing to see it at the time, though, Naomi has a trusted and loyal friend in Ruth, who the Lord is going to use to renew her life and bring her back from bitter to pleasant. And so we pick the story up today in Ruth chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." The writer of the book of Ruth inserts an introductory note here to give us a clue that something is about to take place in the story that's going to begin to turn things around for Naomi and Ruth. Boaz will be one of the major characters in the story going forward. He's described here as a man of standing, meaning he was honored, he's distinguished among his people. This term that was often used for warriors in those days. The Hebrew word literally means a mighty man of valor. You might recognize that term. This is the same term used by the angel of the Lord to describe Gideon in the book of Judges. And he calls him a mighty man of valor. The name Boaz, it means swift and strong, which stands in strong contrast to the meaning of Naomi's deceased sons, you might remember, which meant weak, sickly, failing, sterile. Boaz is going to be the knight in shining armor in this story who rescues Naomi and Ruth. If this were a Disney animated film, every time Boaz appears in the story, the music would change. The most important thing to note about Boaz at this point is that he is a close relative of Naomi and Ruth's deceased husbands. And this is going to be of considerable importance in the story. Verse 2, And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So Naomi and Ruth are in Bethlehem with nothing but each other. Ruth takes it upon herself to go out and glean in the fields behind the harvesters, which means to go along in a field after the harvesters had been through it and pick up any grain left behind. When Ruth tells Naomi what she's planning to do, Naomi encourages her to go ahead, but no, Naomi doesn't really expect her to have much success. The Lord made provision for the poor and the outsider in the law of Moses, which instructed the farmers in Israel to leave a little behind in their fields for the needy to gather for food. Leviticus 19:9, for example, it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God." Over in Deuteronomy 24:19, it says, "When you're harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That's why I command you to do this." Well, picking up the leftovers in the field was not easy work. It could be difficult to gather enough to live on. It was not like there were just large piles of grain simply left for the taking. There was usually very little left behind in the fields by the harvesters. There was often lots of people competing for the same tiny bit of grain in the same fields, which made it that much more difficult to get enough to survive on. Some landowners were not very obedient to the law of Moses. Their fields were picked clean by their harvesters, and they went over them and over them again, leaving next to nothing for the poor. Some landowners simply didn't allow the poor onto their property at all. So the odds were very slim for Ruth to find a field where the landowner would allow her to glean, and to find a field where the landowner was obedient to the law of Moses, actually leaving something behind in his fields for the poor, and find a field that was not already picked over by other gleaners. A question that comes to mind is, why doesn't Naomi go out into the fields with Ruth to glean? Is she too old and too poor of health to do it? Perhaps. And this may be one of the reasons why Ruth felt so compelled to stay by Naomi's side. Is Naomi too discouraged to have the motivation to even try? Perhaps. As we saw in the story last time, Naomi is at the bottom, feeling alone, abandoned, discouraged, hopeless. Proverbs 17:22 comes to mind. A cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. Naomi has a crushed spirit. Verse 3, so she went out, Ruth, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. From Ruth's perspective, she just happens by chance to be working in a field. She doesn't know that this field belongs to Boaz, a relative of her late husband and father-in-law. She doesn't know anything about Boaz. She's never heard of Boaz before. She has no idea how she's connected to him or if she even is. It says, as it turned out, she was in this field. Was it by chance? Of course not. The Lord's working in the lives of Naomi and Ruth, guiding and directing them, even though they're unaware of it at the moment. This is how the Lord works in the lives of his people most of the time. From our perspective, it looks like we are just stumbling along through life, doing what we do, making decisions and choices, turning off the road into this field or that field, gathering the leftover grain or whatever. All the while, though, the Lord is at work in our life. And then after we've gotten a few chapters into our life story, we begin to see how the Lord has been working things out for us in ways we would have never imagined. We look back and think, I see what he was doing there and how all this is starting to connect together. Obviously, we want to seek out the Lord's will for our life and ask him for help in making decisions. But we can also suffer from the paralysis of analysis, can't we? Waiting and looking for a handwriting on the wall type sign, which may not come. Can you imagine what might have happened in Naomi and Ruth's case if Ruth had decided she was just going to sit there and wait for a supernatural sign from heaven before she did anything? Instead, she takes the most reasonable steps she can, given her circumstances. She gets up, goes to the first promising field that she finds, and she starts gathering leftover grain. And the Lord is working in her life. For us, ask the Lord for guidance and wisdom, and then step out in wisdom and faith, remaining pliable toward the Lord, trusting in his sovereignty, that he is working all things out for his good purpose. But to just sit there and stare at the wall, waiting for the hand to come and begin writing, you'd be sitting there a long time. Verse 4 says, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. So the greeting that we see Boaz giving his workers and the response that they give back to him. It gives us some insight, doesn't it, into the kind of person Boaz is. He's a person who obviously worships and respects the Lord, and he is a person who treats his workers well. His workers respect him. Verse 5, Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? So he notices the young woman, Ruth, working in the field, and he wants to know who she is. And I think it's important to point out at this point to make sure you understand that his curiosity about Ruth is not a romantic thing. Not at all. She's out of place. She's obviously not from the area. He doesn't recognize her. He naturally wants to know who this is gleaning in his field. The overseer replies, she's the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. The return of Naomi from Moab was already common knowledge among the people of Bethlehem. News travels fast in a little town. The foreman describes Ruth as a hard worker. She's been working steadily all day. She isn't lazy. She isn't trying to take advantage of Naomi. She isn't trying to take advantage of the generosity of the people of Bethlehem. By her behavior, she gives every indication that she's legit, that she's sincere. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. Boaz, he realizes who Ruth is, that she and Naomi are the widows of his relatives. So he now makes efforts to look out for their well-being. He tells Ruth to stay and glean in his field so he can ensure her safety. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Ruth, she still doesn't know anything about who Boaz is or why they are connected to one another. Her humble response of gratitude is refreshing, though, isn't it? She knows that she's a foreigner, she's entitled to nothing, and she's genuinely grateful for Boaz's kindness. And in verse 11, Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Boaz, he knows about the kindness that Ruth has shown to her mother-in-law, the sacrifices she's made in leaving her own family and homeland, that she has adopted the God of Israel as her own, under whose wings she has now taken refuge. Boaz, he prays that the Lord will richly bless her for all of this. See, Ruth's kindness to Naomi, it inspires Boaz's kindness to her, doesn't it? Have you ever noticed how that works? Kindness, it's contagious, isn't it? Kindness inspires kindness. Show kindness and generosity to others, and kindness and generosity comes back to you. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So Boaz, he extends even more special treatment to Ruth here. He invites her to sit and eat with the workers, something unheard of for the typical gleaner. And then on the sly, he tells his workers to let Ruth pick up grain anywhere that she happens to do so, even among the sheaves already gathered. And he tells him to purposely leave some of the grain stalks behind for her to find, even going so far as to pull out some stalks out of the bundles for her to pick up. I want to say once more that the kindness that Boaz extends to Ruth here is not motivated by a romantic interest. Please don't apply modern sensibilities to this story. It's because he is a guardian redeemer for Naomi and Ruth, which we will talk more about in a moment. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley that she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough, or her little doggy bag of roasted grain that she had left over from her own meal. She gives that to Naomi. The grain she had gathered amounted to about an ephah, or about 30 pounds, which is probably about all that she could realistically carry in a single load. This was way more grain than a gleaner would typically gather in a day, even a hard-working gleaner. Boaz's instructions to his workers about purposely leaving stalks behind and pulling extra out of the bundles for her to find, it must have given Ruth the impression that these Israelite harvesters are the sloppiest workers that she'd ever run into. In reality, it spoke of the tremendous kindness and generosity of Boaz that he extends to Ruth and Naomi. 19, it says, her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Naomi's jaw drops to the floor when she sees this huge amount of grain that Ruth has come home with. She can't believe it. Blessed be the man who took notice of you. She knows there's no way Ruth could have gleaned that much grain without someone stacking the deck heavily in her favor. So she wants to know whose field Ruth has been working in. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardsmen redeemers." It's starting to come together now for Naomi. She's beginning to see that the Lord has not forgotten her at all. He's not stopped showing kindness to her and to her deceased husband and sons. She tells Ruth that Boaz is one of their guardian redeemers, or kinsman redeemers. It's rendered in some of the English translations. And now we see why Boaz has extended such kindness to Ruth and Naomi. Now we discover the motive for his actions. It wasn't a romantic thing. It's out of obedience to the Lord and out of his own kindness. A guardian redeemer, a kinsman redeemer under the law of Moses, was a relative who had responsibility to protect and look after the interests of needy members of their extended family. Some of the duties of a guardian redeemer included buying back family land that had been sold to pay debts, to ensure that that land will not be lost to the family. Buying the freedom of a family member who had been sold into slavery because of debt. Marrying the childless widow of a deceased brother in order to have a child on behalf of that deceased one to ensure that his lineage will continue. Avenging the death of a murdered relative and looking after needy and helpless members of the family. You might actually even recognize that Jesus Christ is our guardian redeemer, isn't he? He's purchased our freedom from slavery to sin and death through his own life. He has redeemed our land that we lost in the fall of humanity. He looks after us, ensuring our well-being. Verse 21, then Ruth, the Moabite, said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Closing this morning, at the end of chapter 1, when Naomi gets back to Bethlehem, she tells everyone, call me Mara, which means bitter. Don't call me Naomi anymore, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. She said, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty, having lost her husband and her sons and facing a life of severe poverty. She said, the Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Now we see Naomi at the end of chapter 2 with a ray of hope beginning to shine through the dark clouds of her life. She says now, the Lord has not stopped showing kindness to me. The Lord's beginning to bring Naomi back from bitter to pleasant. Do you remember the Turkish carpets I talked about earlier? While one of those beautiful carpets is being made, it can look like a jumbled, undiscernible mess with random colors and loose threads going in all directions. Naomi's life looked that way to her. But she's beginning to see the hand of the master weaver at work, who is creating something beautiful. Our lives can look that way too, can't they? A jumbled, indiscernible mess with random loose threads going in all directions, not making any sense to us. But the master weaver knows what he's doing and the beauty that he's creating. Trust him. He's not stopped showing his kindness to you. Even though you may not always see how it's all going to work together, he does. He loves you. He has good in mind for you always. I want to close with this poem that has been often quoted. It's called The Master Weaver's Plan. The author is unknown. It's been attributed wrongly to a number of different people over the years, but as I've dug into it, finally, nobody really knows who the author was. It says, my life is but a weaving between the Lord and me. I may not choose the colors. He knows what they should be. For he can view the pattern upon the upper side, while I can see it only on this, the underside. Sometimes he weaves in sorrow, which seems so strange to me, but I'll trust his judgment and work on faithfully. 'Tis he who fills the shuttle, and he knows what is best, so I shall weave in earnest and leave to him the rest. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly shall God unroll the canvas and explain the reason why. The dark threads are as needed in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he's planned. Let's bow our heads. Father, I want to pray for all of us in this room, God, that we would trust you as the master weaver in our life. You know what you're doing, Lord, and we know that you're doing a beautiful thing in our life. Help us as we look at this jumbled, random-looking mess that makes no sense to us, and know that you know what you're doing and it all makes sense to you. Grow our trust in you, our faith in you, Lord. May we find peace in your good hand in our life. In Jesus' name, amen.